Hi everybody and welcome back to Capricorn Radio. This is your host James and I'm delighted to be talking to a new exciting guest today. We're going to get into some wonderful topics today. We're going to be talking to Mr. Rob Shelsky, an avid and eclectic writer of both fiction and non-fiction, and averages about 4,000 words a day, which is awesome. Rob, degree in science, written a large number of factual articles for the former Alien Skin magazine and as well as other magazines such as Doorways, Midnight Street in the UK, Internet Review of Science Fiction, and many others. While at Alien Skin magazine, he was a resident columnist there for 7 years, and Rob did a number of investigative articles, including some concerning the paranormal, as well as columns about UFOs, including interviews of those who have had encounters with them. He's often and over a long period explored the alien and UFO question and has made investigative trips to such UFO hotspots areas as Pine Bush, New York, Gulf Breeze, Florida, and other such regions including Brown Mountain, North Carolina, known for the infamous Brown Mountain Lights, and as well as investigating numerous places for known paranormal activity. Of course, we're going to talk today about some of Rob's writing. We're going to talk for definite about For the Moon is Hollow and Aliens Rule the Sky. What a fascinating book this is. And there's a couple of new interesting books out as well, Ancient Alien Empire and Megalithia. So without further ado, let's get on to today's guests. Hi Rob, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here, Rob. What a diverse background you have, and I guess you have a deep interest in this paranormal, UFO phenomena, mysteries. Where did this all begin for you, Rob?
It actually began when I was very young. About the age of 7, I started becoming interested in it. I have no idea why. I had a strange dream one night that there were something at the back door of our house in Australia, and I went out to look, and there was something standing there outside. There was a glass window in the back door. And from that point on, I've had this urge to know all things about UFOs, basically.
Wow.
So it's been an evolving process, of course. As I grew older, I began to read more and learn more, and slowly got more and more into the whole subject.
Wow. Rob, I want to focus on your book, For the Moon is Hollow, I guess for the start of the show. This is incredibly fascinating to me, this stuff, because like yourself, and from what I know of your research, you'll admit this, I'm the same. The more I look into this subject, the more I read about authors like you, and the more research that's done, it becomes more fascinating. This moon, this object in our sky, is one of the most fascinating objects on the planet. It's or off planet, I should say. It's everything about this thing is crazy, Rob.
Everything about the moon is crazy. And at first, I didn't believe in the hollow moon theory at all. I was dead set against it because, of course, we have tides on the Earth pulled by the moon. And I said, well, if the moon was hollow, it couldn't have the necessary mass to pull those tides. But on a radio show, they asked me about it, and that was my response. I was like, no, it's not hollow. But that got me interested, and so I began to delve into it more and more and more. And as I did, it began to become more reasonable to me. I was surprised at some of the facts I did find out. And I don't know, it's just there seems to be a lot of evidence for it at this point.
Mm-hmm. First thing, I mean, before we get into density and diameter and its size and all sorts of other stuff, it actually, there's recorded historical evidence that it actually hasn't been there all this time.
No, and that's a strange thing, too. When you say historical evidence, one would think you're referring to recorded historical evidence, and there is really a lot of evidence for that. It has been referred to in history in different cultures as having had a time when there was no moon in the sky. For instance, the Mayans referred to a time when Venus ruled the heaven and there was no moon. Aristotle referred to a race that inhabited Greece before the Hellenes moved into the Greek Isles, and he said they were people who existed there before there was a moon. And repeatedly you have this being said throughout history. Even in the Bible, there's references to it. It talks about the time of the Great Flood and before there was a moon in the sky. So, yeah, it's a recurring theme. The Greeks talk about it, the Romans talked about it, the Mayans have talked about it, and a number of other cultures as well.
Wow, it almost lends credence to Immanuel Velikovsky's theories that, you know, the solar system is young and it's been changing, and the dynamics that we think today has been stable for millions of years may not be millions of years. It may actually be recent.
Well, Velikovsky who, when I originally read his book, I just completely dismissed as well. I really must stop doing that sort of thing because it always comes back to haunt me. But I had just majored in geology at San Diego State, and I was reading Velikovsky's theory and how the Earth had been impacted with catastrophes as a result of these heavenly maneuvers, shall we say, of different planets like Venus. And I flat out rejected it, saying, no, we know that all geological history on Earth is a result of gradualism, things gradually changing over millions and billions of years. Mm-hmm. Since then, geology has shown that that's not always the case, that catastrophes have occurred throughout our history. We've had a snowball Earth. We may have had gamma ray bursts that almost wiped out life on Earth at one point. We have had asteroid impacts. So gradualism, yes, that may function and it does work. But it's periodically we've had catastrophes as well.
Sure. You know what I like about guys like yourself, Rob? It's a better read when you find guys like you that don't go in to this willy nilly. You know that you go in kicking and screaming to these subjects, and you're going to go, I'll either disprove this or I'll keep this my head straight, and I'm out to put this thing to bed or whatever. And you find out that you get drawn into it. These are the people we need, Rob. People like yourself that provide this wealth of information.
Well, actually, I just try to show what I think is possible or even probable at some points, and I hope I get it across, and it sounds like maybe I have, according to you.
Well, indeed, and let's get into Hollow Earth. I did a show on Hollow Earth yesterday, I'm now doing one on Hollow Moon. Let's get into Hollow Moon theory, because let's talk about the density of the moon. It's such a low density, and the ringing of a bell as well. I mean, this is incredibly bizarre stuff, but we have tangible evidence to go on here, Rob.
Yes, we do. First of all, there were 5 main theories of the origin of the moon. These are mainstream scientific theories. And basically, one said it's the accretion theory. The moon just formed along with the Earth. And another one says that the moon was the result of a wandering body that the Earth captured, and another one says the moon was spun off from the Earth. I believe Charles Darwin first proposed that theory, and he said the Pacific Basin is where it came from, and that created the big hole, was the Pacific Ocean. And then another one says that we were impacted by a foreign body that they've named Theia, that was about the size of Mars or slightly smaller, and this resulted in the formation of the moon. However, all these theories have problems. In fact, even the latest one, the impact theory, which is the darling of science right now, has a major problem, and that resulted in several scientists coming up with one called the georeactor fission theory, which says basically it was a natural amount of radioactive elements in the Earth's crust close enough together to cause critical mass, and this blew the moon out into space. And according to the theory, it had to have happened right at the equator for it to work. And that one has problems too. So no matter which theory we look at, they have major problems. The moon is odd. By anyone's standards, the moon is very, very strange indeed. In fact, Isaac Asimov, the noted scientist and science fiction writer, said, we cannot help but come to the conclusion that the moon by rights ought not to be there. The fact that it is one of the strokes of luck almost too good to accept. Well, this is a scientist saying this, not me. And this is what I've been going by, is what scientists have been saying. So they finally came up with the spaceship moon theory in the 70s, 2 Russian scientists of the Soviet Academy. And basically they say the moon is, in some measure, an artificial construct. And they base this on a number of ideas. Mm-hmm.
In a way, as wild as that may seem, it's the one that fits the most.
I'm sorry.
It's the one theory that fits the most, though. It may seem wild to people, but it is the one theory that fits the most.
Well, it's the only one that answers all the available facts. For instance, the moon's orbit is too circular. All but one of the theories cannot account for this because a circular orbit isn't natural. We've studied planets in other solar systems in the last couple of decades, and none of them are in circular orbits. They circle their suns in an ellipse, just like the Earth does and all the planets in our solar system. So to have an almost perfectly circular orbit is unnatural. Secondly, you were talking about the moon's density. It's too low for its size. And they just can't account for this because for the size it is, if it's made of the same basic material as the crust is, it should have more mass and more of a pull on the Earth. And basically, even a NASA scientist said the interior has to be quite different from what we have seen on the surface, or this just can't be. And another scientist, a Nobel Prize winner for chemistry, said, I'm terribly puzzled by the rocks from the moon, and in particular of their titanium content. The moon has a high concentration of titanium in its crust. We don't on Earth. The moon has, I believe it's neptunium, which is a radioactive element, and it has a higher concentration than we have on Earth, and it shouldn't have, not with all the basic theories we have about it.
Wow.
There's vast seas called Maria on the side facing the Earth. It's supposed to be frozen lava. And yet, on the other side, there's none at all. So there's a lot of oddities about our supposedly dead and airless neighbor.
Would it be right to say it's sponge-like then inside, like the holes of a sponge, like a porous or some sort of a sponge-like interior?
Well, some scientists think that there have to be lava tubes on the moon. After all, there are those huge lava fields, and the surface could be riddled with these lava tubes. That would help to decrease the overall mass of the moon, because these would be hollows. It could be these and a combination of caverns as well. The spaceship moon theory says that the Maria, those frozen fields of lava, are the result from the core being pumped out from the center of the moon. Now, the moon does have considerable mass. So when we say it's hollow, we don't mean like a tennis ball with a thin shell and a vast interior. We're talking about something with a thick crust and a smaller hollow center. Even so, that could house millions and millions of people.
Wow. So when they say the moon rings like a bell, what do they mean by that? I think they dropped probes and there was a resonating effect or something like that.
Yes, actually it is called a resonance. You're quite right. And the Earth rings too. Any solid material will ring or resonate, vibrate when you strike it. You need an example of that. Pick up a heavy pot and whack it with a ladle, and it will have a ringing sound to it. But the moon rings far more than it should. It rings for hours. When the Apollo lander landed back on the moon, it resulted in a ring that went on for hours, and they put seismographs on the moon so they know for a fact that this is so. Strange thing about those seismographs, the ring didn't go all the way through the moon, as it does with the Earth. It didn't go through the center, so either something was stopping it, or there was nothing there for it to go through, just a vacuum or open airspace.
Incredible. Wow. You know, we have ringing rocks on the Earth, and you strike stone with stone, and the stones themselves ring. So we do have like a resonance ringing effect on stones on the Earth. Is it a case that the crust has got this titanium or neptunium in it, that's why it resonates more?
No, that would have almost no effect on it whatsoever. It just doesn't have that kind of an impact, that slight bit of difference. When we say there's more neptunium on the moon and titanium, there is too much. We can't account for it, but it wouldn't impact the resonance of the interior of the moon. That's unlikely. But where this titanium and neptunium came from, we don't know. Neptunium has a rather short half-life. For instance, uranium, U-238, it has a half-life of 4.5 billion years. That means in 4.5 billion years, half of all the available uranium has deteriorated. So neptunium has a much shorter half-life, so there should be much less of it. And there is on Earth. It works fine for Earth, but it doesn't for the moon. So where did it come from? It had to have come from somewhere more recently.
Wow. Perhaps, obviously it's dotted with craters and impacts. Perhaps asteroids, would they be a source for the strange composition?
Theoretically, they could be, but this is so evenly distributed that it'd be very hard to see exactly how that's done. Remember, the moon is not what you'd call an evenly distributed world. The far side has nothing but craters on it, and the near side has these vast dark areas, the Maria. So, and also there's another problem as well. With the smaller craters, the depth of the crater is in proportion to the size of the crater, the diameter of it. This is great because this is what one would expect when an asteroid or a meteor strikes the surface of the moon, a meteorite. But unfortunately, with our larger craters up there, the centers are far more shallow. Now, according to the spaceship theory, the two Russian scientists came up with, and they weren't fringe people. These were mainstream scientists.
Sure.
They said that was because there was an inner shell of some kind of metal about 5 miles down, and that inner shell would be about 25 miles thick, so that when a meteorite or an asteroid struck the moon, it was small, it wouldn't penetrate that far, so you'd have a natural crater with a natural depth to it. But the bigger craters with the bigger asteroids would sink and hit that inner shell and bounce off, and that would create the flatter crater. They wouldn't be in proportion like the small ones were.
Incredible. It's almost like we're talking about the Dark Star here from Star Wars, Rob.
You're not the first to have mentioned that. I know. It is very strange. Is the moon a natural object? It may well be, but if it is, it has been altered. Its crust is very similar to that of Earth's. Oh, and by the way, the impact theory, which is so popular right now with the idea of another planet striking us and a ring forming and the moon forming from that, that is getting more difficult to swallow because, number one, the radioactive isotopes on the moon are in proportion to those in the Earth's mantle. However, there is no other radioactive isotope on the moon at all that we know of, and every body in the solar system has its own isotopic signature, if you want to call it that. That's how we know a meteorite is from Mars or from the moon or from elsewhere. We can check that signature. Unfortunately, with the moon, there's only the signature of our isotopes on Earth and nothing from the planet Theia. Now, you smash two planets together and break them apart pretty much and have temperatures of 18,000 degrees centigrade, you should have isotopes from both planets landing on the moon and forming the moon. This doesn't seem to have been the case.
Wow, incredible. The thicker crust, can you explain the crust? Because the crust isn't uniform either. There's a thicker crust on one side, is that correct?
Yes, the far side of the moon has a thicker crust than the nearer side. And again, with the impact theory, that perennial darling of astronomers, they say it's because, we were wrong about how the moon was formed from the impact. There must have been a main one and then a smaller one, and that smaller one crashed into the far side of the moon, and that's why the crust is thicker there. This makes that theory increasingly unwieldy. And again, it doesn't explain the amount of titanium on the moon. It doesn't explain the amount of neptunium on the moon. It doesn't explain why the moon resonates like it does. It doesn't explain the circular orbit. There's so much it doesn't explain that it raises more questions than gives answers to.
Perhaps we shouldn't have called Neptune Neptune. We should have called the moon Neptune.
Well, they've made so many artificial radioactive elements these days that keep going up the chart with them, and some of them only last a split second before they disappear, that we've come up with all sorts of names: Californium, Francium, you name it, with Americanium. We've got them all.
For sure. What is going on with this 28-day thing? Because can you explain the dark side for the audience? Why we have a dark side? Why we have a near side?
Well, to quote Pink Floyd, there is no dark side of the moon. It's all dark. It is as far as being mysterious goes. We don't have a dark side of the moon. We have a far side of the moon and a near side. The Earth and the moon are actually a double planet system. That means the center of gravity between the two of them is not at the center of the Earth, but further out in the Earth's crust. Kind of like a dumbbell effect.
Yeah.
And as a result, the moon has one face locked, always facing the Earth. But as the moon rotates the Earth, the backside comes into sunlight. We don't see it, but that's why we have a new moon, a dark moon. But then gradually, as it keeps on swinging around, we begin to see the phases of the moon, first a quarter, then a half, and then a full moon. So that explains why the moon has daylight on both sides, but it takes a month, or 1 month, for it to do this, about 28 days. So it's 14 days of dark and 14 days of night.
Wow, incredible. The fact is that everybody looks at this thing, Rob. I mean, no matter what part of the planet you're on, we're all looking up at this thing. And it's only been questioned in recent times through people like yourself. Why? Well, perhaps it's been questioned in ancient times too. We just, in terms of a Western modern world, I should say. Why the recent resurgence in this moon? Is it because the technology that we have now has brought up to evaluate this object in our sky?
I think that's one of the reasons. When NASA first started its moon missions, it commissioned its own report on the moon on translunar phenomena. These are short-lived phenomena seen on the moon because they needed to know more about it since they're planning to land a man there in a few years. This was in the early 60s. And that report came back, and it was basically covered 5 centuries. Now, translunar phenomena have been seen on the moon for far longer than that by many people. But the telescope was invented about 5 centuries ago, first invented. So they kind of went with that period because observations would be more reliable. And based on that, they see many strange things on the moon. They see flashes, beacons, volcanoes, and there are no active volcanoes on the moon. They see streaks, they see flashes, they see glows that last for months at a time, sometimes for years. They see these blue glows and flashes near the Aristarchus crater. And so often has that been seen around that crater that the nickname for it is the blue gem.
Wow. What would be causing the flash of light? We're talking a civilization up there. We're talking about entities.
Well, it's not the weather, because the moon has almost no atmosphere at all. It's so tenuous as to be virtually non-existent. I mean, seriously, it's such a small percentage that it's almost a pure vacuum. And it's not a magnetic field because the moon doesn't have one. And therefore, there isn't a lot it could be. It can't be volcanoes because there are no active volcanoes on the moon. So it has to be something else. Besides, volcanoes wouldn't leave tracks and streaks on the surface. It wouldn't cause blinking lights to move slowly across the surface. It almost has to be something extraterrestrial or something animated in nature.
Everything we're talking about here, and anytime I talk about this recent times, it just seems artificial. I agree with you. Artificial is the probably best one word you can to describe the moon. Artificial. It's the one that encompasses all without getting too, bogged down in the philosophy of what it might be or why it's there or whatever. But everything just screams artificial, Rob.
And it's not the only hollow moon in the solar system, apparently. Mars has one as well, Phobos.
Wow.
It is so light that it would float in water, and yet we have observational data to show the surface is rock. There is an odd monolith on it as well.
Yeah, Phobos I've looked into too. This strange monolith on Phobos it's like a standing stone, or it's like some sort of a strange feature. And apparently Phobos is leaking a gas as well, or some sort of a mist. Is that correct?
Yes, it does seem to be. And by the way, mists have been spotted on the moon, too. They've had fogs and clouds where there can be no clouds or fogs, not naturally, because there's no air to speak of at all. And and yet they've seen something of the same on Phobos. So they think it's either venting gases from within, which it should have long since ceased to have done, because it's very small. It's only about, I think it's something like 17 miles in length. It's roughly cylindrical in shape, but and if it is riddled with holes, any interior gases should have long since gone. They thought that Phobos and Deimos were captured asteroids, but the orbits aren't right for that. They don't think they are captured asteroids. And also, Phobos has a very strange orbit. It seems to speed up down at times.
Wow, really?
Mm-hmm.
Let's go wild here, Rob. What I think? I think the moon, if I was to look at all the details and I say, okay, well, my opinion from what I see and what I analyze and all the data, it's like it's an artificially constructed sphere that has a protective layer of regolith on top, either to, number one, disguise, or two, protect, or both. And it's like, if you think about if you were going to go travel the galaxy, Bob, and you had the ability to power a craft that big, what better thing than to make your own moon?
Well, that's my theory in my book. I base it on the fact that they've found so many Earth-like planets already that they postulate there must be billions in our galaxy alone. Out of these billions, they say there must be millions that have life, and out of those, there must be at least hundreds of thousands that might have intelligent life, and some have been around a long time. And as intelligent species develop, one of the things they would want to do is utilize asteroids and maybe moons or moonlets, because there's a great deal of wealth in asteroids. The average asteroid with any mineral content at all is said to be equal to $9 trillion in value, if we put an Earth orbit in mind, and that's equal to the sum product of all the economies on Earth for any given year. So it would be natural to start to hollow these things out just for their mineral value. What are you left with? This big, hollow object that could be utilized as a spaceship to travel the cosmic sea.
Wow, incredible. Yeah. Not only hollow it out, get the goodies out of it, but then turn it into a vehicle and you're finished, eh?
Well, even Carl Sagan said it would be probably far more budget, financially conscious to use an asteroid as a space station rather than to build one in space, because To build one in space from scratch, you have to ferry all this stuff up from Earth's extreme gravity. Well, it costs a fortune. Whereas if you just guided a smaller asteroid into orbit around the Earth, and I don't want to say terraform it because you never live on the surface probably, but inside of it, you could house anywhere from 50,000 to 1 million people. So you could have a good-sized city inside of an asteroid. What's more, you have that thick outer shell that would protect you from radiation, the sun's solar flares, all sorts of things. And if you had fusion power, you could send this out into deep space. Moreover, we're likely to do that because there's a vast amount of resources at the edge of our solar system. We have the Oort cloud with all the comets, and we have the Kuiper belt with all the plutons in it. These are Pluto-sized planets, and smaller, and they carry a lot of volatiles, oxygen, hydrogen, that sort of thing. So if you're about to step off the shore into galactic space, you would probably want to take some of that with you, and you could shepherd it along with you when you went. And in the depth of space, if you're disguised as an asteroid, a moonlet, or a moon, you're pretty safe because some of those intelligent races aren't going to be nice. On Earth, we have high competition in life. Everything competes for the available space, tries to occupy every ecological niche. Therefore, we can't assume it stops at the edge of our atmosphere. It must be the same probably everywhere in the universe, and our galaxy included. Therefore, there's competition, and where there's competition, there are predators. We're one of them.
You know, and there's a good point. I spoke to Dr. Brooks Agnew yesterday about Hollow Earth, and he had described to me, which I never realized the statistic, but that something like 15% of our time is in the elements outside. Most of the time, the human race is either indoors, either underground, indoors, or protected. And for all intents and purposes, we're not exposed to the elements, whether you're in your car, your office, your home, whatever. We're just indoors all the time, whether that's due to work-related commitments or protecting ourselves from vicious climates, whatever, too hot, too cold. And when you think about it like that, to have an underground civilization or a hollowed-out moon or a hollowed-out asteroid or a hollowed-out Earth doesn't really, seem that extravagant considering that's what we do on Earth anyway. We just don't realize it. We think we're just, we're free to go above ground. But if civilizations are to develop, I'm guessing, this is the best way. I mean, you wouldn't be building something that you're going to expose yourself.
No, and even if we colonize Mars, we wouldn't do that, not unless we terraformed it, and that would take centuries to millennia. And also, there's a real advantage to being on inside of an asteroid or a moon. Excuse me. They protect so much better than the surface of the Earth, and they're not dangerous like the Earth. We have hurricanes, we have tsunamis, we have cyclones, we have snowball Earths, we have major earthquakes, we have volcanoes. You wouldn't get any of this inside of an asteroid or inside of the moon. You'd be perfectly safe. You'd also have the perfect camouflage. They think now there may be more rogue planets that have just drifted off into interstellar space, than there are actual planets revolving around all the suns in the galaxy. Wow. So you could be lost among these. And from the outside, you would look to be a dead world, for the most part. Every now and then you'd have to vent something like gas or mist and excess or waste products. No closed system is perfect. Over time, it needs new resources, and it needs to vent its waste products. And that could very well be why the moon ended up where it has, because it had to come into a solar system and basically refuel. Also, if you're out in the cold depths of interstellar space, about once every 50 millennia or so, you might want to warm yourself by the fire of the nearest sun.
Oh, for sure. And like what we're talking about here, Rob, this sounds like this moon has been anchored in position. And when I say like anchored, like you say, you put your feet by the fire and you warm up, you refuel, you get yourself back on track. And then, is it a case then this thing has been anchored for too long? Why anchor it? Do you want to? Is it a case? It's fine. I can see why it would be anchored there, but why has it not left? Is it a permanent fixture for any particular reason?
Well, if you're talking about fusion power, if they do not have super faster than light FTL speeds, and if they're moving moons and asteroids around, they may not, and they may be running from predator intelligent species as well and trying to hide from them. They might, number one, want to use this as a decoy. We're beaming our radio waves and television stuff out into the universe, and if there's any predators nearby, they'll go for us, not for this dead world sitting next to us. Number two, define long. If you're spending millennia, hundreds of thousands of years going through the cosmos, because if you're going below the speed of light, it takes a long, long time. These are generational ships. We're not just talking a few hundred years, but thousands upon thousands of years. Then parking itself in orbit around the Earth for 10 to 12,000 years may not seem long to them at all.
Sure. This, like you say, this is a double planet system. The Moon versus the Earth in size is very, very unique, Robert.
It's too unique. Again, scientists talk about that too. They basically say that alone, of all the rocky worlds in our solar system, we have a moon that is just too big. Erwin Shapiro of the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics said, the moon is bigger than it should be, apparently older than it should be, and much lighter in mass than it should be. It occupies an unlikely orbit and is so extraordinary that all existing explanations for its presence are fraught with difficulties, and none of them could be considered remotely airtight or watertight.
I somehow think, Rob, that the moon is anchored in position, and I have no problem believing it's an artificial construct when I look at the data, and I need the data, and that's fine. However, when you look at the eclipse at the distance it's at, and then it also regulating the tides on the planet and having a calming effect on Mother Earth, it kind of tells you then there's some very deep affiliation with the Earth, that perhaps at one time, if there is a civilization up there on the moon, or still inhabitants, maybe dwindling civilization perhaps, they just don't want to be on the Earth anymore. There's a detachment there.
I do mention that in my book as well. They may be a retrograde culture. I would think the biggest danger of any civilization setting sail inside of an asteroid or a moon for thousands upon thousands of years. Already they're xenophobic because they would be afraid of predator alien species. But also, if you're that close to society, alone in the middle of nowhere for that long, you'd become introverted and xenophobic. Also, your civilization just simply may not last forever. It may become degraded. They may have had a high technology and still have it compared to us, but it may not be what it once was. So there's a lot of possibilities. Another thing, we're not sure how long the moon was there. If you go by those comments in recorded history, it would seem to have come anywhere from 10 to 50,000 years ago. It can't have been too much longer than that, because recorded history in the sense of verbal legends and that sort of thing would probably have failed over too much longer a period of time. However, you're right, the moon does have a stabilizing effect on the Earth for the seasons. The Earth would roll around like a billiard ball if it didn't have the moon there, and it does have an effect on tides. However, the sun also has a tidal pull on the Earth too, so the Earth has always had tides, even if the moon was there or not.
Mm-hmm. I just think that if the moon has been put in place, it was put in place to help the Earth, not necessarily. I mean, if the asteroid, moon, hollow spaceship theory, whatever that is, I mean, if it was parked there, and they didn't just put their feet by the fire, Rob, I think they put it just at the right distance by the fire to also make sure that that fire stays at a nice temperature. It's in a way, there's a double effect there. It's not just parking a vehicle. I think it's parking a vehicle with the aid to the helping where it's parked, and I just think it's a bit more than that.
Well, of course, if you go by mainstream science, the moon's been there for billions of years and was much closer to the Earth. In fact, so close at one time there would have been tides on the land as well as in the seas, and those tides on land would have been the land being lifted up in a wave 100 feet high and rolling across the face of the Earth. It'd be pretty hard to build on something like that, I would imagine. And but if you go by the idea of it being the hollow moon theory, yes, it is at a good distance. Of course, that distance is changing every year by an inch or so, I think. Excuse me. And it is constantly changing. But yes, they could have parked it where they parked it for a number of reasons. And those reasons could have been beneficial to the Earth. However, never look to give tours too closely in the mouth, because you might see problems.
Sure.
Having the moon where it is, only about 250,000 miles away, puts it in a very strategic location. Every military on Earth throughout history has always emphasized the need to control the high ground. Guess who controls the high ground in our skies? Guess who looks down on us every day?
Mm-hmm.
They do, and I'm putting they in quotes, whoever they are. And on top of that, they're within easy access of the Earth. They can come and go as they please. If they want resources, they get it. If they want manpower, or human power, they could get that too. And judging by the number of cases of the disappeared each year, which is my new book coming out, Deadly UFOs and the Disappeared, they could have a slave labor force. It's not all to our benefit. And it's evidence they may have been messing with our history for millennia. For instance, Alexander the Great's own historian recorded that silver shields appeared in the sky and frightened the war elephants and the troops and sent them scattering while they're on the edge of the Indus River ready to cross into India proper. And it so panicked them that although they did end up crossing the river, they didn't stay. There was basically what amounted to a rebellion, and they just simply, or mutiny, and they just said, we don't want to go any further. So those UFOs had the effect of stopping the eastward expansion of Alexander the Great.
Wow. So, Rob, let's talk about, leave the conspiratorial evidence out of it, whether we did go to the moon or not. Because I think what people seem to miss is that there is evidence that the moon is artificial. First of all, the whole moon itself is artificial. Therefore, if there's artificial structures on the moon, that's not too big a jump then if the whole moon is artificial, is my point. So let's talk about some of the artificial structures on the moon. This stuff is just rife. I mean, some people say we never went to the moon. Some people said we did go to the moon, but we got warned off. And the structures on the moon, it's a minefield of information, disinformation, confusion. What's your feeling for the structures on the moon? I presume it it just fits in.
Sorry, go ahead.
So I just presume it fits in with the artificial moon on extra. It's like icing on the cake, I guess.
Well, first of all, I think the moon is not maybe necessarily a complete artificial construct. Again, I think it may have been converted. Sort of like a camper shell on the back of a pickup. But I also think that we have been to the moon, definitely. I was there when they started launching them to the moon. I listened in all night to the first landing on the moon. I was very young, but I remember it very clearly. And I also remember that that ham radio operators were intercepting these broadcasts because they were open channel at the time. And these were from different points on the Earth, so you could triangulate the source of these. And they were coming from the moon. And also on the way to the moon and on the way back. So we know they went there. And also we have seismographs left on the moon. They're still sending us evidence of moonquakes. By the way, there are no tectonic plates on the moon, so there should be no moonquakes. And they argue that, it must be the tidal pull of the Earth causing these moonquakes. And yet the moonquakes are not centered where the stress from the tidal pulls should be. So that's another mystery. Moonquakes where there should be none. But, I think they made it to the moon. I think they left things behind on the moon. And I think they may have seen things on the moon. There has to be some reason why we haven't gone back in over 40 years. We've certainly had the technology.
This is the thing for me. It's a very pertinent question, Rob. Why haven't we gone back? I mean, I think we went to the moon, and I think they were told to leave or they were warned off. I mean, if there was a civilization there and it is an artificial construct, perhaps they can't leave our system anymore. Maybe the fuel system ran out. Maybe it's permanently anchored there and they can't escape. However, they're not.
Or maybe they're colonizing the Earth. I mean, excuse me. A lot of conspiracy theorists say that they're creating a hybrid human race. Maybe we are the aliens, so to speak. Why leave when you've got this lush blue planet so close by? It may have been just too tantalizing and too tempting to want to leave. So there is that aspect of it too. I do think they might be a retrograde culture. That could very well be. No civilization lasts forever.
Oh, sure. Incredibly fascinating stuff, Rob. What's the response to the hollow moon theory, Rob, with yourself? How do you find other people? Did they absorb this? Did they embrace this? Did they look at the data?
Well, if I go by the fan mail, the response has been good. It's been overwhelmingly in favor of the idea. And again, I think because I kind of present it in a rational way, and I don't claim that this is so. I just say that this is a good probability.
Sure.
But I do get some people who get very angry, and they say, well, you're not even discussing the tides on the moon. Well, yes, I did discuss the tides that the moon caused on the Earth. And they said, well, the diameter of the moon, with that size, it would have to have a tidal effect. Well, it does. But every scientist will tell you the moon's too big for its mass.
Wow.
The stuff the mainstream scientists do.
It doesn't add up, does it? It doesn't. It doesn't.
No, it doesn't. There's something strange going on there. But I have a fear that it may not be to our best advantage to have the moon there, as far as whoever may be on it.
Oh yeah, and when you look at the overall picture of if there is somebody up there and it is an artificial construct, that's not a good thing, because.
Well, if you think about it, I mean, they have seen photos of what looked like a bridge on the moon. 2 different astronomers in 2 different locations spotted this what looked like an ancient stone bridge on the moon, and then it vanished from everything after that. There was some kind of fort in one area, or what looked like a fort. I saw the photo. It was very rectangular, and then it subsequently disappeared, and this was after they allowed that one satellite to, quote-unquote, bomb the moon, and it was right in that area that it did it. Was that to destroy that evidence? I don't know, but it could be. There was the case of that one scientist being interviewed, and on his desk were photographs, and they were just scattered there quite casually. And one of them showed that picture, and the only reason we have it is because the interviewers had taken a picture of him, and in that picture were the pictures on the desk. This was a NASA scientist in his office.
You know what I'm just thinking there, Rob? Imagine you've got this holiday destination called the moon, and we've got these scientists throwing probes at the moon. What's the people on the moon going to think these are? They're getting bombed, like, with these probes. They're under attack as far as they're concerned. I don't think we should be putting probes on the moon like that, Rob.
Well, they've had so long to monitor our communications. I'm pretty sure they know what we're doing and when we're doing it. I think they have allowed some of it, as long as it doesn't impact them. Mm-hmm. And they noticeably. And we were talking about myths and things, and there have been signs that maybe something has been vented, including Aristarchus crater. So they may be inside. Now, they may have had bases on the far side of the moon, mining operations on the surface. Helium-3 is plentiful on the moon, whereas it's not on the Earth. And therefore, if they have a fusion power-run civilization, that would be ideal for them to have that available to them. So, yeah, we probably are interfering with them in some ways, and I think you used the expression warned off. It's not a new expression, but it's a valid one, and I think we have. I think there are certain areas of the moon that are off limits, and I think there's a reason why we haven't gone back in 4 years. You do realize that it would have been cheaper to have mounted another mission to the moon than to pay for the space station. In today's dollars, the entire Apollo program cost less than the space station has cost. Billions of dollars. Mm-hmm. So when they say, well, we can't really afford trips to the moon, so we'll do a space station instead in near-Earth orbit, that was far more expensive in the long run than another project of going to the moon or even putting a colony on the moon would have been.
Like we discussed earlier, I think if we're ever going to do anything in space, I think we should forget going to Mars. I think, okay, I don't think this is a good idea in light of what we're discussing, but I'm just thinking that, how are we going to colonize anything or leave our planet if we can't even colonize the moon? I obviously think there's probably something there, and we probably shouldn't do that because we may have been, quote, warned off. However, I mean, why don't we, this is the big question, why don't we try to colonize the moon? Why don't we go to the planet that's 250,000 miles from Earth? I mean, why are we trying to sell this idea of going to Mars? I mean, why not try and colonize this thing? There's obviously a big reason for this, Rob.
Why are we bypassing the moon? Yes, exactly. And actually, we seem to know more about Mars than we do about our own moon, and it's only 250,000 miles away versus the 53 to 65 million miles Mars can be wherever it happens to be in its orbit. Mm-hmm. So, yes, there's a vast difference there. I think we haven't colonized the moon because, again, I think we were warned off. Yeah. I think it's every nation has been sending satellites to orbit the moon. China put a probe on the moon, but that one quickly failed and didn't stop functioning. And we canceled the rest of our Apollo program. So I think something strange is going on the moon, and I think that's one reason why there's all this talk of bypassing it.
Do you think NASA is in a full-scale cover-up, or is it only perhaps a few people that kind of know, and it's kind of they're just keeping the lid on it, or is it literally a full-scale cover-up?
I think it's several tiers of cover-up. I think on the most basic level, the average janitor or electrician probably has no idea there's a cover-up, but I think on a higher level, there most certainly is, and I think that includes the technicians who've been airbrushing photos. I think it includes those who have cut off conversations with astronauts whenever they mention something about aliens. There was that case of that female commander, and I wish I could remember her name, but I can't offhand. she's on the video, she's clearly talking, and she says, I see that alien spaceship again, and then bingo, the sound stops. She's still talking. Her mouth is still moving. She's still floating around that cabin, but you don't hear her. They've switched her to a private channel. And ham operators have said that they've overheard messages too. Now, this is secondhand and therefore not as reliable, but that video I watched, and she clearly is talking, and you're not hearing her anymore right after she says that. So, yeah, I think they're covering it up, and I think people have been finding out, including ex-NASA employees have come out with facts about it. So, and I'm not sure that NASA itself has decided to do the cover-up. I think they've been instructed to, whether by our government or a shadow government, I'm not sure, but I'm inclined to think it might be a shadow government.
Sure, for sure. Rob, I'm going to switch gears and maybe talk about another book, but before we do, can you just tell us where people will get a copy of For the Moon is Hollow and The Aliens Rule the Sky? And please give us your website as well, Rob.
Sure. I just use a blog spot. It's robshelsky.blogspot.com. You can find links to all my books there and more information about me. Or you can just go to Amazon and you can order it either in print or in Kindle. Or you can go to, I believe it's Smashwords, and they have it available there in all the other ebook formats. Or you can order it through Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, whoever you'd like to.
For sure. Rob, you write 4,000 words a day. That's obviously the work of a passionate guy.
Yeah, it is. My brother had a missing time experience, and that was kind of the catalyst for me. That's when I really started getting heavily into all of this. I trust my brother, whereas, you might not trust someone else, although actually I've interviewed a lot of people and found them eminently trustworthy. And people have no reason to lie whatsoever. One was an old couple in Gulf Breeze, Florida. They were in their 80s. He was a chemical engineer. She was a school teacher. They had seen the first UFO in 1949, I believe it was. And here they are sitting down on the harbor in Gulf Breeze when I'm there. And I said, well, why are you here? Because they were showing me the photos they'd taken of these things. And I said, you've seen them. Why are you still here all these decades later? And they said, because we want to know. And that's exactly what I want to do. I want to know. I want to know what's going on, to what extent it's going on, and what the ramifications are for the human race.
Oh, for sure. Rob, you've wrote into extensively on aliens, UFO deaths, disappeared. I think that's probably the most pertinent. Let's talk about the disappeared and UFO deaths. This is incredibly interesting for me.
Yes, that's my new book, and it was already supposed to be out. It's languishing a little bit. I didn't get the galley till a week or so ago, and I've been working on that, and it's done, been sent back, and so it should come out hopefully by the end of this week. But, yeah, the disappeared are frightening, and up until recently, nobody was talking about this. It was one of those oddball, mysterious things that short little books were done by people like Chet Dembeck or, others who do these, I call them chap books or booklets rather than full-length books. But no one tied it in with the UFO phenomena. I think it was David Paulides, I can't pronounce his name well, who did a much more thorough thing on it with his 411 books. And so what I did was I tried to tie it all in. And the evidence for the disappeared is enormous. In the United States alone, 900,000 to 1 million people disappear a year. Most of these are because they want to run away, they want to hide, they want to start a new life, or they've been abducted by kidnappers. Some are killed. The vast majority are teenage runaways. But there's that percentage every year, 3 to 5%, who are never found again. And those aren't accounted for by deaths and or murders.
That's incredible numbers, Rob.
Well, there's 35,000 a year disappearing in Australia the same way. Again, most are found, but there's that same percentage that are not. And if you multiply that times the world, then every year the number is over 1 million at least that are disappearing.
Not to draw too many parallels between Australia and America, but I mean, Australia does not strike me as a country that would have a very high number of disappearing people.
Yes and no. I mean, you would have people disappearing in the outback, yes. Those are usually accounted for, and their bones are usually discovered, or bodies are usually discovered later. Again, the vast majority of disappearances are accounted for sooner or later, but there's that nagging 3 to 5% that are never found, and that's a large number. Out of 1 million people, 3% is 30,000 if I'm doing my math right.
Yeah, 3% of 3% of a large number is still a large number, as they say.
Yes, it is, and that's just one country. So it's a phenomenal amount of people that are disappearing, and no one seems to be making a big deal out of it. And this has been going on for centuries. Owen Parfitt, an Englishman, he claimed that he could run a long distance. I'm sorry, he's not the one I was thinking of, but he was sitting on his front porch, and he was crippled. He couldn't move, literally. And this was in 1763 or 1768, depending on which account you go with. And he disappeared off the front porch, and there was nobody around it, but there were some laborers inside of him. No one can explain what happened to him. They never found him again. A man too old and too crippled to move under his own. They had to carry him in and out of there. There was another case in England where a man was boasting he could run a long distance. So they had a bet. He started running down a road, and his friends followed close behind him in a horse and cart to make sure he wouldn't cheat, kept him in sight. He seemed to trip and fall forward and just vanished, never seen again. 3 men on an island on the Flannan Isles off the coast of Great Britain were manning a lighthouse there. They just vanished without a trace. No sign of violence. No sign of anything. They just are gone. This goes on and on throughout history. Famous people disappear as well as others. You have all sorts that disappeared. New York socialites, Dorothy Arnold disappeared in 1910 while walking through Central Park. Ambrose Pierce, who was writing science fiction or fiction stories about a farmhand who disappeared, he himself disappeared in later years. Never found, body never found.
Wow. What about the Bermuda Triangle? Has it still got disappearances involved in it? Has it died down in recent years?
Yes, I do touch on the Bermuda Triangle. The Bermuda Triangle seems to be an ongoing phenomenon, and it seems to have clusters of disappearances and then other points in times where it's not quite so bad. Recently, I haven't heard of as many disappearances there. That doesn't mean they aren't happening. It just means that I wasn't paying attention probably because my interests lie more elsewhere. I think, enough has been said about the Bermuda Triangle. I can't add more to it, except that, again, these are disappearances as well, and some big ones. But also there is I think it's called the Devil's Triangle or the Dragon's Triangle over near Southeast Asia, where there are even more disappearances than in the Bermuda Triangle. And, of course, there are the so-called deadly vortices, these places on Earth that are like forbidden zones. I traveled through one of them in Mexico, the Zone of Silence. And,
oh, really? Wow.
And it is a very strange place. And, yes, you lose phone, you lose radio, you lose everything there. It comes and goes at best, but most of the time it's gone while you're in the Zona de Silencio. And there's another one just like it over in the Sahara. And there's, I think 12 total around the Earth, and they're spaced evenly just above the equator and just below it at the same latitude. And no one can account for why this is.
I think they featured the Zona del Silencio on Ancient Aliens, and they were talking about even a missile got dragged into it in a vortex type fashion.
Yes. The only trouble is we never seem to be able to witness this. Even this person that fell forward in England, he just vanished. They assumed he'd fallen into a shallow depression in the road, like some half-foot or foot-deep pit, because they have potholes. But no, he was just gone. And it was open countryside. He couldn't have jumped up and run away without them having seen it. And it isn't just individuals, but entire groups disappeared, as you were talking about the Bermuda Triangle, but other groups as well. And even villages have vanished, entire villages. Oh,
incredible. That really begs the question, and how whole villages disappearing. Do we link this with the UFO phenomenon? Is there a reason that perhaps they maybe abduct and do not return?
That's an interesting question. They do date back. The Virginia Dare and the colony on Roanoke Island disappeared around 1587 to 1590, while the one man was absent and then came back and found them all gone. John White, I believe it was. And no one knows what happened to him. There have been theories. There have even been hoaxes about it later on in time. And it all has proved pointless. Some people said, there are people with gray eyes among the Native Americans in that region. They must be the descendants. Well, absolutely no evidence for this at all, even those eyes. That was just said at the time and became like a rural myth as opposed to an urban myth. There is a problem here. We have the abducted. that are supposedly in the millions. And I am a member of MUFON, and I am a field investigator.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very aware of this aspect of things, having studied it a lot. These people honestly claim they have been abducted. My brother has missing time. He does not claim abduction because he doesn't have any memory of that. But he and a friend do have from midnight till 9:30 in the morning missing time, and they did see a strange light in the sky and went to investigate it, and that's the last they remember.
Wow.
So I think the abductions are real. But why are some people being returned and not others? And yes, UFOs have been sighted around some of these disappearances of villages. The one in Canada, for instance, they said there was strange blue lights in the sky, and one was a cylinder shape. Now that story's gotten a bit garbled because with each retelling, it just gets a little worse each time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But basically, it was the Anticooney village in Canada in around 1930, where all the villagers vanished. But again, they're not the only one. More recently, in 2010, I think it was, a village apparently disappeared in China. All the villages disappeared.
Really?
And it was supposed to have been near a nuclear power plant. They thought maybe it was evacuated for some reason by the military, and the military was seen in the nearest town, but the military was carrying missiles and tanks and rockets towards the village and that area. And why would you have that equipment if there had been a radiation leak? You'd be getting everyone out of the area, and you certainly wouldn't worry about bringing in tanks and missiles.
Wow, perhaps they seen something and they went in to tackle it and they were too late, perhaps.
Well, lights had been seen in the sky all the prior nights, strange lights in two nearby towns. So again, we have that connection with UFOs. The UFO phenomena is far from being benign
Mm-hmm.
or benevolent.
Mm-hmm.
If you believe that there are space brothers, then I have to ask you this. Name me one case where anyone can cite that a UFO has helped people. Help someone out of a burning building, like by beaming them out of it like they do when they're abducting people, supposedly. Or shining a light down so children like Hansel and Gretel lost in the forest can find their way out of the woods. Anything at all that was benevolent or benign. And yet I can cite hundreds of cases where people have been injured, property has been damaged, people have been killed, sometimes in groups, and abductions. And what they do to these abducted people, from what we hear, is not good. It's a violation of their human rights in every respect. So I don't find that there are space brothers. At least the evidence seems to be to the contrary.
I think there's a growing consensus that it's a genetic harvest. Any interaction with us is a genetic harvest by the extraterrestrials.
Well, it's interesting about this abductions versus the disappeared. The abducted people are returned. My brother had a small plastic object he dug out of his elbow, which triggered his memory of the event. He didn't remember being abducted. He just remembered seeing that light in the sky with his friend while they were camping in the desert, called him up, and they hadn't talked to each other in 16 years, or something like that, and basically said, "Do you remember this?" And he goes, "Well, I do now. I didn't up until you mentioned it." And he was so convinced that there was something to this that his friend, John, picked up his family from San Diego, moved them to Las Vegas to be near my brother so they could pursue the matter further.
Wow, this is incredible, Rob. Of course, it's different for you, Rob, as you say. It's a very personal story to you, and you know, when you know somebody that's had a strange event, you're not detached from the story, and it's very, very different for you then. So, I guess that's...
Well, mind you, my brother's no paragon of virtue. I mean, he's just an ordinary human being.
Yeah.
But he has no reason to lie about this.
Yeah.
Furthermore, he was very interested in it for a couple of decades there and really was trying to find answers. And now he's completely moved away from it. He wants nothing to do with it.
Really? Wow. Rob,
the answers he found frightened him, basically.
Yeah. A lot of people think that the Greys, let's talk about different races of aliens for a moment, because these Greys seem to have this benevolent experiment. A lot of people talk about the abduction and then medical procedures being, whereas others, Nordic, don't seem to have this story alongside. But whatever, let's focus on the Greys for the moment. They seem to have this genetic exploration or harvest or biological experiments going on. I talked to another researcher, and he says perhaps they lost their curator, and he alluded that they don't have any hierarchy anymore. They've lost their curator, perhaps, that they're just experimenting on us.
Well, first of all, I don't think those experiments are benevolent, because people are being abducted. They're not being invited on board these ships. They're being taken. That's a violation of human rights. That's kidnapping. Secondly, they're being subjected to all these procedures, extremely painful ones, and then made to forget. Well, just because you forget something doesn't mean it didn't hurt.
Yeah. I think, here's the thing, I think if they were out to just really be psychopathic and harm us, they wouldn't make us forget. They would just do what they wanted to us.
Well, I mean, they could be trying to keep the lid on it. They could be in collusion with our government or some form of shadow government. I mean, even President Eisenhower referred to a shadow government. Former Hawaiian Senator Inouye, before he died, referred to the same thing. Various famous personages have all mentioned the idea of a shadow government or a very powerful military-industrial complex. So they could be in collusion with them, they could be doing it on their own, or maybe our government's powerless to stop them and just trying to hide the facts so we can lead a reasonably normal life.
I think there's one thing we should mention. There seems to be some sort of uniformity in the reports about the different races. There's like what people refer to as the Greys, the Reptilians, the Nordic-looking blondes. Seems to be that there are races, as we call them. Like there's a generic race out there of different groups of people.
And there very well could be. In fact, you could have a multi-national society, for want of a better term, on the moon. When races set sail into interstellar space, they may meet up with others, and they may decide to work together. I have a friend up in New York State. He's an amateur astronomer. He's a brilliant man. He had a security clearance while he was working, and for fairly top-secret projects, and he claimed several abductions in his life. He couldn't talk to me about them personally. I had to have him send me a videotape where he videotaped himself. And the poor man was chain smoking and sipping from a drink the entire time, and it took him about, I'm not exaggerating here, 15 false starts before he finally was able to speak. And he said that he was abducted, and there was a gray involved, but that these blue, dwarf-like creatures in hoods came to him, and they're the ones who took him and seemed to be under the supervision of the gray. And, of course, I was skeptical, and I said, well, is there anything else you can remember about it? He said, in what way? And I said, well, were any other senses involved besides vision? Because I'm thinking a dream here, you know. He said, yes, it was a terrible smell. I said, there was a smell? He said, yes, the blue ones smelled like rotting wet cardboard. And that really struck me, because that's the first time I've ever heard anyone describe a smell.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah, I thought so. And again, he's one of those people I believe. I mean, if he's good enough to get a security clearance to work on, well, I can't even tell you what he was working on because that's not even permissible, but
sure.
He had a high security clearance, and he was a brilliant man, and he was a consummate scientist. So I have very little reason not to believe him. And the odd thing was, the way he talked, I said to him later on the phone, I said, you sound almost sad that you're not being abducted anymore, because it started when he was a child and apparently stopped when he was in his early to mid-20s. And I said, you sound almost disappointed. And he said, you know, Rob, in a way I am. I said, why? Are you like a jilted lover? He said, exactly. While I was being abducted, I was unique. I was important. I was special. And then it stopped.
Sure.
Now, if this man is having delusions of grandeur because he's special for being abducted, why then would he have the delusion it stopped? It doesn't match up, you see.
Yeah, for sure. You know, I spoke to Kathleen Marden and Stanton Friedman about the Betty and Barney Hill story, and I think the one thing that stands out, many things stand out in that story, but one massive thing that stands out is that she was able to describe a medical procedure that had not been invented yet on planet Earth.
I think that was amniocentesis, and I believe you're right. I believe she did, and this is not uncommon. We're starting to do these probes now, cameras being swallowed, that sort of thing, but we sure as heck weren't doing it in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Yeah, it was unheard of. It was unprecedented, and these are the things that stand out for me. You know, I look for evidence, Rob, and I look for tangible, credential parts of the story. I don't need it to be sit there in black and white on the table, but I do look for that. And I think when you take an intelligent mind on some of these matters and you look for some of the evidence, you'll find it. Um, it's just a fascinating subject. Rob, I just want to for posterity, I want to mention your book, Ancient Alien Empire Megalithia. It looks fascinating, Rob. It really does. And I'm a megalithic researcher myself, so just to clarify for the audience, when we talk about in UK and Ireland anyway, but the megalithic culture here, we talk literally about northwestern Europe. But you're talking, Rob, about the monuments around the world in this book, yeah?
Yes, all around the world, and also other evidence such as areas in India that have high radiation backgrounds that they shouldn't have, including in places that underwent some type of destruction like Mohenjo-daro.
Oh, yeah.
But these megalithic structures date back, and it's very hard to date them because they're made of stone. We know how old the stone is, but that doesn't tell us how old the structure is. But we have it on reliable evidence that some of it dates back to 15,000, 18,000 years ago, and perhaps a great deal longer.
Wow, incredible. Tell me the premise for the book then, Megalithia. This is a source culture. Perhaps we're saying these are linked to aliens in a way?
Well, I coined the term megalithia because I needed a name for the empire. I think at the time the world population was quite low, as scientists say. I think it was worldwide, and I think maybe from the moon they came here in person, and the extraterrestrials, and they set up themselves as the governing body of the earth, and I don't think they were particularly kind people either. For instance, the Sumerians, their legends of the Anunnaki, or for them it was a religion, not legends, were created humans as a slave race to do their mining for them for gold. There's evidence of mines in South Africa, for instance, that date back 50,000 to maybe even 250,000 years ago. So this may have been a worldwide power that exercised control over a highly isolated hunter-gatherer type of people and used them to their own advantage when they wanted to, and perhaps maybe even partially created them. I'm not against the hybridized theory at all.
Sure. Do you think perhaps their consciousness, well, okay, setting aside the hybridization theory, do you think perhaps their consciousness or awareness just wasn't there, Robert? It wasn't at a high level, and as a result they abused them, they slaved them out for work, and in a way they were religious. These guys were gods. I mean, these guys had knowledge. It may be something that we see today as just technology, but it was powerful knowledge to the ancients.
Well, I think it was, and I think we absorbed some of it. I think it's no accident that human civilization started, and this is a direct quote, as if overnight, close quote, by many archaeologists. It just suddenly happened, and we have no idea why. And it didn't just suddenly happen in one spot. It seemed to have happened simultaneously around the planet. That was one of my arguments for this megalithia empire, because something above the rest of us that had the ability to be worldwide must have delivered this knowledge. If it was localized, it only would have been one area, and then would have spread out like bacteria growing in a petri dish slowly around the planet, this knowledge that we've acquired. But no, it seems to have suddenly occurred in multiple places simultaneously. And that means it should have had one source origin, and that source origin might have been extraterrestrial.
Wow, it's a very important point, Rob. Very important point. I mean, yeah, look at the Olmecs, the source culture of all Mesoamerica, 3000 BC, India, 3000 BC, Egypt, 3000 BC, megalithic Ireland, Britain, 3000 BC, China, again, 3000 BC. And I say 3000 BC because it seems to be an explosion going off then, in that strange time frame on our planet. But perhaps there was a reason for a second wave of invasion or creation of monuments. Maybe it's much older.
I think a lot of these monuments actually date back further than you realize. There's the one in the Göbekli Tepe site that they think dates back almost 15 to 18,000 years ago, and it's a monolith. Series of monoliths. There are monoliths on the Indonesian islands that seem to date back that far. And again, we're not sure how far back all the monoliths date, and they may not date to the same time, but it would seem likely that a culture, worldwide megalithic culture, might have existed, collapsed. India talks about an interstellar war, literally in the Vedic texts.
Oh, yeah.
Those go back almost 3,000 years before Christ, and they talk about times much farther back in their history, and they say there were no less than 400 distinct alien species and that a war raged in space, not only on Earth, and that there was even a crash landing on the moon. Now, here's a culture so far back in time it's inconceivable to us now, and they're talking about space?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how do they even have that concept? The rest of us just think that, pretty lights in the sky, the cavemen in Western Europe at the time.
And this is the thing, when you look at ancient cultures, like especially Mahabharata, Vedic scriptures, the Upanishads, incredibly wild stuff for us to read today because we just can't accept the history of our own planet. But when you look at it, if you were to say, I don't believe that, well, I'm sorry, I just don't think these guys invented science fiction. I just can't see it. Science fiction is an incredible concept in ancient times. You just can't do it. I don't see how you can project yourself into the modern world 5,000 years later and create all this stuff.
No, and also there is the fact that they talk about what certainly sounds like a nuclear blast. Mm. The elephants below being set on fire, running around, maddened, the armies being decimated, and the survivors being tainted with an invisible poison that they tried to wash off in the rivers by immersing themselves in water, and about plants and animals dying in the area from some invisible poison. If this isn't and hair and fingernails falling out, if these aren't symptoms of radiation sickness, I don't know what is. Mm-hmm. And this is in a text that dates back long before the time of Christ. We have a problem here in the West. When we started conquering the rest of the world, we went with a superior attitude. Our religion was the true religion, and everyone else were just myths and legends and to be discounted. So when the British Empire stretched around the world and spread its tentacles everywhere, basically, mm-hmm. they went with the idea of civilizing people. As Rudyard Kipling put it, it was the white man's burden to civilize. Well, that was a obviously racist and also superior attitude. We discounted anything anyone else had done or built as being inferior to ourselves, and I think that lingers to this day.
For sure. Do you think then that us noisy humans, either we've been created as a slave race or maybe some sort of a loose agreement to work with either ancient aliens or something like that? Do you think we just rebelled and we rebelled because we woke up? We rebelled because we became aware of knowledge, and we just we wanted what they had, and we wanted to do it ourselves, perhaps.
That's a complicated subject, but the Vedic texts talk of a rebellion. We also talk of this occurring at the time of the Great War. We have evidence for radiation on the ruins of old castles in Scotland and in Germany. Mm-hmm. We have the evidence of a stone vitrified there, and not in any of the surrounding area that the stone came from to build those castles, and vitrified only occurs at extremely high temperatures, thermonuclear temperatures. And we have had the same thing happen at White Sands, New Mexico with the test blasts we had there. Secondly, I think we were slaves. The history of the Sumerians with the Anunnaki say that the privileged humans were the priests who served in the temple. Now, what you have to remember is we have priests serving in temples today, but they literally were serving according to those texts. They literally were bathing and serving food and keeping the palaces of the Anunnaki overlords in good shape. Mm-hmm. So originally, religion might have come from the idea that we had to serve the gods. And to this day, we still have priests who serve in churches and temples. Mm-hmm. Does religion come from that? I don't know, but it's an interesting idea.
For sure. It's funny enough, the vitrification of the places in Scotland, I watched a documentary on that a long time ago now, Rob, but they had burnt half a forest down. Originally, they naively thought that the vitrification was done deliberately to solidify the rock and make it stronger. However, they tried different methods to burn the rock and with heat, with forests, and I mean, they chopped half a forest down, Rob, and they couldn't even they barely got the rock to melt.
Vitrification literally means turning rock to glass.
Yeah.
And again, you can't do that by burning wood or burning charcoal. We even can't really do it very well with forges up until the late 1800s in any quantity. To think that someone would come up with the idea to vitrify the rock of a fort, just making a fort back then would have been one incredible task, and one that took years to accomplish. Mm-hmm. And then to cut down woods to burn to try to vitrify the surface of this rock would have been an exercise in absolutely utter futility. More likely, those woods were burned at the same time the fort was struck.
Sure. Okay, you talk about the Great Flood as well. Perhaps, I don't know, I'm a bit dubious sometimes. I sometimes think it was a natural event that perhaps they let happen and didn't warn anybody and only warned a few, or maybe they created it, Rob. What's your take on that?
Well, in my Hollow Moon book, I do mention the Great Flood because one of the references handed down is that there was no moon until the time of the Great Flood. Now, if someone was parking the moon in an orbit around the Earth, whereas you had the sun's tides, moving our oceans around, you suddenly would have this moon coming into position, and suddenly you'd have some pretty massive tides, not to mention earthquakes. And this could have accounted for the Great Flood. It could have ripped the ice caps apart, for instance, with the tidal pull of the time. It could have precipitated the end of the last ice age in this respect, raised the sea levels. It could have caused earthquakes, could have caused volcanoes. Moving a thing the size of the moon near the Earth is going to have repercussions for the Earth.
Wow. Very important point there, Rob. You know, if this artificial moon theory is what it is, then parking that thing in place and waiting for things to settle down would take a while, and that would have massive tidal effects.
Well, it depends on how close. I mean, you don't necessarily have to come so close that you can cause a 1,000-foot tidal wave. Although you might very well cause a number of tsunamis, which is the better term for it, I guess. But you don't necessarily have to have the kind that would sweep over continents, for instance. But you could have earthquakes, tremors, and you could have tides where there had never been tides before. We have evidence that the Mediterranean basin has been dry a couple times throughout the history of the Earth, and or at least while it existed on the Earth. And so there is evidence that the Atlantic Ocean broke through there at the Straits of Gibraltar and filled it, not once, but twice, I believe. So things do change with time. The other odd thing is about the time this supposedly occurred, this Great Flood, is about the time civilization started. So here you have recorded history and verbal legends saying the moon wasn't always in the sky and then suddenly appeared in very primitive times just before the start of recorded history. You have the Great Flood occurring, and you suddenly have civilization taking off worldwide at about the same time. Highly coincidental.
Let's talk about megalithia, as you coined the term, which I love, by the way, Rob. And all these megalithic monuments around the world, one thing they're all known for is either one, extremely large stones, intricately carved or matching stones together. Perhaps talk Sacsayhuaman in Peru, or moving the stones at the Great Pyramid, and this, I'm talking about the internal chambers with all the 50-ton slabs, not a sheet of paper between them. This, for me, Rob, is high technology as an engineer. This is incredible feats of engineering. Do you consider this to be the direct evidence of ancient aliens?
I do, and partly because the biggest engineering projects of all were the great platforms, like the one in Baalbek, Lebanon. And this thing was so huge. Now, they said, oh, well, the Romans must have built it to put their temples on. No, it was there a long time before the Romans and was mentioned in it. The Greeks did have temples there, but you were talking something that is incredibly massive in the way of a platform. It's high. You know, it's meters and meters high. It is thick. These stones were gigantic stones. I mean, I'm not talking a few tons, even a few tens of tons, but sometimes well over 100 or more tons. One, I think, was even 200 tons. These things are huge, and they were laid in a platform far bigger than any Temple Mount would have required. By the way, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is another one of those platforms. These are massive and huge. You would never, ever have needed a platform to build temples on of such thickness and size and durability. This was built for some other purpose. And according to the story of Gilgamesh, the Babylonian story, they were, it even refers to fiery rockets ascending and descending at the site of Baalbek.
Yeah. Oh, the Epic of Gilgamesh is an incredibly fascinating story, for sure. Perhaps then, when you look at all these megalithic monuments around the world, all these incredible works of stone that they created, it was rampant. At one point in time, it was rampant, Rob, all around the world. And there dead begs the question. I mean, all these cultures have to be linked somehow, and if it's not the individual cultures migrating from source culture to source culture, you know, it lends credence to the ancient alien theory. But why the disappearance of the megalithia culture? Where did it go? Why did it cease to build?
And it seemed to cease at the same time everywhere, and again, virtually overnight.
Yeah.
For centuries they were doing it, and suddenly everywhere around the planet, it just stopped, almost completely. Did some cultures then later probably duplicate the efforts of their ancestors or try to? Yes, there is some evidence for that too. But the main megalithic culture, and no, I didn't coin the term megalithic. I did megalithia, naming the empire. But I think it stopped because they withdrew. I think you had relatively small, isolated populations, probably mostly in coastal areas around the planet, that were being controlled by these beings, for want of a better term, and I think that something happened, and they withdrew, and suddenly the world government, if you want to call it that, collapsed, and without it, everyone was isolated again. The knowledge was gone.
Wow.
I don't think people were taught, you see. I don't think they were taught how to do this. I think the extraterrestrials helped them to do this. There's evidence for that, too. We simply... Today, they were saying it would take something like 35 or more cranes to lift one of the smaller stones of the Baalbek site.
Mm-hmm.
And you couldn't do it with those cranes because there's too many. You couldn't fit them all around the rock to help lift it. There wasn't enough room. So how they did it, even to this day, remains unknown. And that was one of the smaller stones. So something was going on, and whatever that something was, it was beyond our capabilities at the time, almost certainly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, without a doubt, I definitely think that's right. You know, that this megalithia, it's all gone at the same time. There's a disappearance of these monuments, and they're either left to decay and further renovation, or extra cultures come in then and go, what is this? I mean, how many cultures, Rob, then say that, you know, they inherited these monuments?
And they do, and of course they say the gods built them. You know, which is kind of telling in itself.
Sure.
One thing else to remember, some of these megalithic cultures occur underwater.
Wow.
Excuse me. And so that helps date them. They had to have been before the end of the last ice age or right at the beginning of it, because as the ice melted, it slowly filled the seas, made them higher, and of course drowned these things. So they had to have been built before this happened.
Are you talking Yonaguni, perhaps?
Not just that one, but there is the Karnak with a C, not a K as in Egypt, but in France. Those stones go down into the water, and also on an island, there's a circle of them, and about a third of them are below water.
Sure, yeah, and the island across from Gavarnie, I've been there, Rob. Incredibly fascinating place. You're not allowed to actually get to that island anymore, sadly. And they take the boats over to Gavarnie, but yeah, that stone circle, half of it's in the ocean.
And also there's thousands of these stones. Why were people doing this? You're talking about primitive civilizations and cultures. Actually, we thought most of them, until recently, were just basic hunter-gatherer cultures. You are expending an enormous amount of capital energy to erect these rocks, to carve them, to shape them, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
To what purpose? What purpose are those thousands of Karnak stones for? They seem to serve no purpose that we know of. But they might have served someone else a purpose. Whoever these extraterrestrials were, they built to last. And they did it at a time when the local population of the planet Earth was quite incapable of achieving such feats. And even if they could, they wouldn't have spent their lives doing it. Mm-hmm. They would have been trying to survive and grow and prosper.
Wow, incredible important point again, Robert. If you think that it was just sheer manpower, muscle moving these rocks around, well, then that would imply that these guys had a way of life that was able to support that effort, i.e., they would have had to been farming. They would have had to been, you know, producing large quantities of food to support that network of construction. You know,
exactly. And I think that either someone was helping them out with this, with the stone constructions,
mm-hmm.
and or also helping them out with the food supplies. I think there's a lot more going on here than meets the eye. And, I mean, I can understand a smaller temple like the one at Göbekli Tepe possibly being for religious reasons for the local populace, and they just built it because they had nothing better to do, and they didn't want to live more than a couple of years anyway, because all their time was spent building this instead. But then you still have the problem with the animals carved on those stones.
Oh, yeah.
They don't belong there. They weren't in that region.
Mm.
How did the local populace know about these animals?
And there's no source of fresh water nearby, so and it's at a location that's it's to the nearest source of fresh water. You would still have to bring the water up and the food to that location. They didn't live there. We know they didn't live there. So
no, you had to bring all your materials up there, and it was a heck of a hike. We're talking miles here, and to an altitude that wasn't real conducive, and to a place that just wasn't really nice to live at all. Why would you do that? Why wouldn't you build it closer to home, for one thing?
Mm-hmm.
And number two, why would you purposely bury it? Every archaeologist says it looks as if it had been purposely buried.
Yeah, for sure. Rob, wonderful book, Ancient Alien Empire, Megalithia. Incredibly interesting. I like the way you tie everything together. And I like the way you apply the ancient alien hypothesis to this in the way you do. So, Rob, give us your website one more time, and we're going to wrap it up with that.
Sure. It is robshelsky.blogspot.com. Pretty simple.
Okay, cool. Robert, what's new for you before we go? What are you working on now? You still writing for magazines and daily stuff like that?
I'm supposed to be starting my own imprint in this genre for Permuted Press. I have 3 science fiction books with them: The God Factor, The Creator Code, and The Babylon Effect. And they've seen my success with this nonfiction genre, and they want me to start a new imprint with them, so I'm seriously considering that. And I am about to get that other book out, Deadly UFOs and the Disappeared, hopefully by the end of this week.
Wow, what a busy guy, Robert. What a busy guy. Listen, Rob, I look forward to talking to you in the not-too-distant future. Such a great guy and a great show, great intellectual discussion. I really thank you for your work, Rob, and I'll talk to you in the not-too-distant future.
Great, and thank you so much for having me. Actually, it is called a resonance. You're quite right. And the Earth rings too. Any solid material will ring or resonate, vibrate when you strike it. You need an example of that. Pick up a heavy pot and whack it with a ladle, and it will have a ringing sound to it. But the moon rings far more than it should. It rings for hours. When the Apollo lander landed back on the moon, it resulted in a ring that went on for hours. And they put seismographs on the moon, so they know for a fact that this is so. Strange thing about those seismographs, the ring didn't go all the way through the moon, as it does with the Earth. It didn't go through the center, so either something was stopping it, or there was nothing there for it to go through, just a vacuum or open airspace.
Incredible. Wow. You know, we have ringing rocks on the Earth, and you strike stone with stone, and the stones themselves ring, so we do have like a resonance ringing effect on stones on the Earth. Is it a case that the crust has got this titanium or neptunium in it, that's the way it resonates more?
No, that would have almost no effect on it whatsoever. It just doesn't have that kind of an impact, that slight bit of difference. When we say there's more neptunium on the moon and titanium, there is too much. We can't account for it, but it wouldn't impact the resonance of the interior of the moon. That's unlikely. But where this titanium and neptunium came from, we don't know. Neptunium has a rather short half-life. For instance, uranium. U-238, it has a half-life of 4.5 billion years. That means in 4.5 billion years, half of all the available uranium has deteriorated. So Neptunium has a much shorter half-life, so there should be much less of it. And there is on Earth. It works fine for Earth, but it doesn't for the moon. So where did it come from? It had to have come from somewhere more recently.
Wow. Perhaps, obviously it's dotted with craters and impacts. Perhaps asteroids, would they be a source for the strange composition?
Theoretically they could be, but this is so evenly distributed.
Wow.
That it'd be very hard to see exactly how that's done. Remember, the moon is not what you'd call an evenly distributed world. The far side has nothing but craters on it, and the near side has these vast dark areas, the Maria. So, and also there's another problem as well. With the smaller craters, the depth of the crater is in proportion to the size of the crater, the diameter of it. This is great because this is what one would expect when an asteroid or a meteor strikes the surface of the moon, a meteorite. But unfortunately, with our larger craters up there, the centers are far more shallow. Now, according to the spaceship theory, the 2 Russian scientists came up with, and they weren't fringe people. These were mainstream scientists.
Sure.
They said that was
Hi everybody and welcome back to Capricorn Radio. This is your host James and I'm delighted to be talking to a new exciting guest today. We're going to get into some wonderful topics today. We're going to be talking to Mr. Rob Shelsky, an avid and eclectic writer of both fiction and non-fiction, and averages about 4,000 words a day, which is awesome. Rob, degree in science, written a large number of factual articles for the former Alien Skin magazine and as well as other magazines such as Doorways, Midnight Street in the UK, Internet Review of Science Fiction, and many others. While at Alien Skin magazine, he was a resident columnist there for 7 years, and Rob did a number of investigative articles, including some concerning the paranormal, as well as columns about UFOs, including interviews of those who have had encounters with them. He's often over a long period explored the alien and UFO question and has made investigative trips to such UFO hotspots areas as Pine Bush, New York, Gulf Breeze, Florida, and other such regions including Brown Mountain, North Carolina, known for the infamous Brown Mountain Lights, and as well as investigating numerous places for known paranormal activity. Of course, we're going to talk today about some of Rob's writing. We're going to talk for definite about For the Moon is Hollow and Aliens Rule the Sky. What a fascinating book this is. And there's a couple of new interesting books out as well, Ancient Alien Empire and Megalithia. So without further ado, let's get on to today's guests. Hi Rob, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here, Rob. What a diverse background you have, and I guess you have a deep interest in this paranormal, UFO phenomena, mysteries. Where did this all begin for you, Rob?
It actually began when I was very young. About the age of 7, I started becoming interested in it. I have no idea why. I had a strange dream one night that there were something at the back door of our house in Australia, and I went out to look, and there was something standing there outside. There was a glass window in the back door. And from that point on, I've had this urge to know all things about UFOs, basically. Wow. So it's been an evolving process, of course. As I grew older, I began to read more and learn more, and slowly got more and more into the whole subject.
Wow. Rob, I want to focus on your book, For the Moon is Hollow. I guess for the start of the show, this is incredibly fascinating to me, this stuff, because like yourself, and from what I know of your research, you'll admit this, I'm the same. The more I look into this subject, the more I read about authors like you, and the more research that's done, it becomes more fascinating. This moon, this object in our sky, is one of the most fascinating objects on the planet. It's our off planet, I should say. It's everything about this thing is crazy, Rob.
Everything about the moon is crazy. And at first, I didn't believe in scientists of the Soviet Academy. And basically, they say the moon is, in some measure, an artificial construct, and they base this on a number of ideas.
Mm-hmm. In a way, as wild as that may seem, it's the one that fits the most.
I'm sorry.
It's the one theory that fits the most, though. It may seem wild to people, but it is the one theory that fits the most.
Well, it's the only one that answers all the available facts. For instance, the moon's orbit is too circular. All but one of the theories cannot account for this because a circular orbit isn't natural. We've studied planets in other solar systems in the last couple of decades, and none of them are in circular orbits. They circle their suns in an ellipse, just like the Earth does and all the planets in our solar system. So to have an almost perfectly circular orbit is unnatural. Secondly, you were talking about the moon's density. It's too low for its size. And they just can't account for this because for the size it is, if it's made of the same basic material as the crust is, it should have more mass and more of a pull on the Earth. And basically, even a NASA scientist said the interior has to be quite different from what we have seen on the surface, or this just can't be. And another scientist, a Nobel Prize winner for chemistry, said, I'm terribly puzzled by the rocks from the moon, and in particular of their titanium content. The moon has a high concentration of titanium in its crust. We don't on Earth. The moon has, I believe it's neptunium, which is a radioactive element, and it has a higher concentration than we have on Earth, and it shouldn't have, not with all the basic theories we have about it.
Wow.
There's vast seas called Maria on the side facing the Earth. It's supposed to be frozen lava. And yet, on the other side, there's none at all. So there's a lot of oddities about our supposedly dead and airless neighbor.
Would it be right to say it's sponge-like then inside, like the holes of a sponge, like a porous or some sort of a sponge-like interior?
Well, some scientists think that there have to be lava tubes on the moon. After all, there are those huge lava fields, and the surface could be riddled with these lava tubes. That would help to decrease the overall mass of the moon because these would be hollows. It could be these and a combination of caverns as well. The spaceship moon theory says that the maria, those frozen fields of lava, are the result from the core being pumped out from the center of the moon. Now, the moon does have considerable mass, so when we say it's hollow, we don't mean like a tennis ball with a thin shell and a vast interior. We're talking about something with a thick crust and a smaller hollow center. Even so, that could house millions and millions of people.
Wow. So when they say the moon rings like a bell, what do they mean by that? I think they dropped probes and there was a resonating effect or something like that.
Yes, even the hollow moon theory at all. I was dead set against it because, of course, we have tides on the Earth pulled by the moon. And I said, well, if the moon was hollow, it couldn't have the necessary mass to pull those tides. But on a radio show, they asked me about it, and that was my response. It's like, no, it's not hollow. But that got me interested, and so I began to delve into it more and more and more. And as I did, it began to become more reasonable to me. I was surprised at some of the facts I did find out. And I don't know. It's just there seems to be a lot of evidence for it at this point.
Mm-hmm. First thing, I mean, before we get into density and diameter and its size and all sorts of other stuff, it's actually, there's recorded historical evidence that it actually hasn't been there all this time.
No, and that's a strange thing, too. When you say historical evidence, one would think you're referring to recorded historical evidence, and there is really a lot of evidence for that. It has been referred to in history in different cultures as having had a time when there was no moon in the sky. For instance, the Mayans referred to a time when Venus ruled the heaven and there was no moon. Aristotle referred to a race that inhabited Greece before the Hellenes moved into the Greek Isles, and he said they were people who existed there before there was a moon. And repeatedly you have this being said throughout history. Even in the Bible, there's references to it. It talks about the time of the Great Flood and before there was a moon in the sky. So, yeah, it's a recurring theme. The Greeks talk about it. The Romans talked about it. The Mayans have talked about it, and a number of other cultures as well.
Wow, it almost lends credence to Immanuel Velikovsky's theories that, you know, the solar system is young and it's been changing, and the dynamics that we think today has been stable for millions of years may not be millions of years. It may actually be recent.
Well, Velikovsky, who, when I originally read his book, I just completely dismissed as well. I really must stop doing that sort of thing because it always comes back to haunt me. But I had just majored in geology at San Diego State, and I was reading Velikovsky's theory and how the Earth had been impacted with catastrophes as a result of these heavenly maneuvers, shall we say, of different planets like Venus. And I flat out rejected it, saying, no, we know that all geological history on Earth is a result of gradualism, things gradually changing over millions and billions of years. Mm-hmm. Since then, geology has shown that that's not always the case, that catastrophes have occurred throughout our history. We've had a snowball Earth. We may have had gamma ray bursts that almost wiped out life on Earth at one point. We have had asteroid impacts. So gradualism, yes, that may function and it does work. But it's periodically we've had catastrophes as well.
Sure. You know what I like about guys like yourself, Rob? It's a better read when you find guys like you that don't go in to this willy nilly. You know that you go in kicking and screaming to these subjects, and you're going to go, I'll either disprove this or I'll keep this my head straight, and I'm out to put this thing to bed or whatever. And you find out that you get drawn into it. These are the people we need, Rob. People like yourself that provide this wealth of information.
Well, actually, I just try to show what I think is possible or even probable at some points, and I hope I get it across, and it sounds like maybe I have, according to you.
Well, indeed, and let's get into Hollow Earth. I did a show on Hollow Earth yesterday, I'm now doing one on Hollow Moon. Let's get into Hollow Moon theory because let's talk about the density of the moon. It's such a low density, and the ringing of a bell as well. I mean, this is incredibly bizarre stuff, but we have tangible evidence to go on here, Rob.
Yes, we do. First of all, there were 5 main theories of the origin of the moon. These are mainstream scientific theories. And basically, one said it's the accretion theory. The moon just formed along with the Earth. And another one says that the moon was the result of a wandering body that the Earth captured. And another one says the moon was spun off from the Earth. I believe Charles Darwin first proposed that theory, and he said the Pacific Basin is where it came from, and that created the big hole of the Pacific Ocean. And then another one says that we were impacted by a foreign body that they've named Theia that was about the size of Mars or slightly smaller, and this resulted in the formation of the moon. However, all these theories have problems. In fact, even the latest one, the impact theory, which is the darling of science right now, has a major problem, and that resulted in several scientists coming up with one called the georeactor fission theory, which says basically it was a natural amount of radioactive elements in the Earth's crust close enough together to cause critical mass, and this blew the moon out into space. And according to the theory, it had to have happened right at the equator for it to work. And that one has problems too. So no matter which theory we look at, they have major problems. The moon is odd. By anyone's standards, the moon is very, very strange indeed. In fact, Isaac Asimov, the noted scientist and science fiction writer, said, "We cannot help but come to the conclusion that the moon by rights ought not to be there. The fact that it is one of the strokes of luck almost too good to accept." Well, this is a scientist saying this, not me. And this is what I've been going by, is what scientists have been saying. So they finally came up with the spaceship moon theory in the 70s, 2